Thanks, Nevin. So welcome everyone. Hello and welcome. And thanks for joining us on the very first of our new virtual online forums. Nearly 200 of you registered for this evening's event, and we're really delighted that there's been such a level of interest in tonight's subject matter. So just to give you a bit of background, the Angling Trust has been working on shark angling issues in recent years. And in 2019, the Shark Angling Club of Great Britain joined the Angling Trust as a member club. And since then, we've been working with the club and with Dr. Simon Thomas on a number of shark angling initiatives, science and research initiatives that showcase just how important angling is for gathering data on shark populations. So we're really privileged this evening to have Simon here talking to us. I don't know if any of you have heard any of his presentations before. He has given a presentation at Brixham in, I think it was October or November 2019. Some of you may have been there. He really is an expert in this subject and has an enormous wealth of knowledge on blue sharks in UK waters over many years and many thousands of shark captures. So it's going to be a really fascinating talk, and I'm really pleased that so many of you are here to join us. For those of you that aren't members of the Angling Trust, I would implore you to consider joining us. We can only do things like this, and we can only do the work that we do on behalf of the angling community with more members. So if you would like to consider joining, please visit the website at anglingtrust.net and join up there. And for those of you that don't receive our regular Sea Angling newsletters, hopefully Nevin can provide you after this event with a follow-up questionnaire, which will also give you details on how to sign up to our monthly newsletters. So without further ado, I will hand you back over to Nevin, who will then hand you over, hopefully, to Simon, and his presentation can begin. So thanks once again, and I hope you enjoy this evening.
Yeah, just to reiterate David's welcome to everybody. Simon, if you'd like to make sure your microphone's on now and that we can see you.
Should be there.
Okay, that's great. And yeah, thank you for the presentation this evening. As you can see, we've still got people arriving, but if you'd like to share your screen, and good luck this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, folks. Well, first of all, I'd like to welcome you all to this talk, which is on the return of blue sharks to the UK waters. It's a subject that's fascinated me for many years, and hopefully I can do it some justice tonight. I was frankly amazed when I found out how many people actually wanted to attend, and I can only presume that lockdown fever is worse than I feared. Either that or there is really nothing on the telly tonight, so thanks very much for joining me. I'd just like to say that although my name is on this talk, none of this work is possible at all without the help of various organisations and people. I'd like to thank especially the Shark Angling Club of Great Britain for giving me the privilege to actually look through their data, the Sports Angling Club of the British Isles, who again have shared data and have been hugely supportive, the many skippers who have provided additional data, and of course to all the anglers who actually go out there and catch sharks, because without you none of this would be possible. I'd like to give a special word of thanks to John McMasters, who has been an incredible help to me during this, and the amount of effort he does behind the scenes on this and many other subjects really isn't appreciated. Right, introduction, what this talk is going to be, and I really want to split it into two halves. Firstly, I'll introduce myself and try to explain why I feel this work is important. I'm not just a scientist, I've also been an angler since I was very young, and I'd like to go into that a bit. I'd like to briefly talk about the biology and ecology of the species, and then explain why properly designed tagging programs are incredibly useful, and then present some data from an actual program that the Shark Angling Club of GB actually participated in from 1998 to 2011. We'll then take a break, which you'll probably need, and I will endeavour to answer some of your questions. During the second part, I will present some real catch data, which has recently been completed. It is now a total catch record from 1953, which was the inception of the Shark Angling Club of Great Britain, to present. I will try and explain what this can tell us, and also how it can inform conservation, and why conservation bodies and bodies that actually control global stock management are interested in this sort of data. I'd also like to talk about why the levels we actually see, and the levels between years we see in this country might not actually relate to real stock levels. And this is especially valid to a fish that can migrate 4,000 plus miles during a year. I also want to build on some earlier work that's been done on sharks in the UK, especially by Vass in 1990 and Mitchell et al. In 2014, who showed how local environment affects the shark numbers we see in the UK and their distribution. But I then want to talk about more global events and how global climatic variations and changes in the North Atlantic, miles away from here, can actually affect the number of blue sharks that reach our shores each year. I will then try and show how these factors can be compensated for by modelling, that dreadful term that happens on all those talks you see at 5 o'clock on telly when the government are talking about COVID. In my case, I'm using it to try and give a truer picture of the state of the Atlantic blue shark stock in general. And I'm also going to try to address whether we can actually tell from our data whether stocks are recovering or whether the fish just moved. I'll then try and summarise the results and hopefully take some more questions at the end. Now, there's some pictures of me with some fish, which I apologise for. I was incredibly lucky to have an understanding family, and that my next brother Andy, who some of you may know from running the tackle shop in Falmouth for many years, was an angler and took me angling from a very early age. I'd also like to credit with my mum, who used to get up at 4:30 on a summer's morning to drop me off at some lake or river. I was also amazingly lucky to spend many of my summers in North Devon on an isolated house on the cliff. And many of you poor beagle anglers from the North Coast might know a lonely looking white house between Hartland Quay and Hartland Point. That was where I spent a lot of my summers, either swimming, climbing, rock pooling or fishing. So I was incredibly lucky. I did a fair bit of match fishing, mainly coarse match fishing from my teens to my late 20s, but I've always sea fished, whether from beach or boat. And when I moved to the Sussex coast with my wife, I spent an awful lot of time fishing for bass, smooth hands in the summer, and then cod flatfish in the winter. Notable catches, well, I've been lucky enough to have 40 bass over £10, which sounds a lot, but those who knew the Sussex bass boat fishing at the time will realise it probably isn't that many. I've had pollock to 21.12. I've had a cod of £32.6 from the UK. Probably though, my absolute favourite catch would actually be, I managed 3 roach over £2 during the same match, which was a Winter League fixture from the River Arun at Billingshurst. Just happened to be in the right swim at the right time. I'm very fortunate to have caught or seen caught over 4,200 blue sharks, either from crewing from Dave Uren's charter boat, either the Warrior or the Mirage from Plymouth, or from my own boats. I've seen blue shark fishing at its very lowest point, and then I've seen the return of these amazing creatures to our waters, and quite frankly, sometimes in astonishing numbers. The biggest fish I've ever seen, or blue I've ever seen, which was shown in the previous slide, was captured by Andy Mansfield of the SCBI, which we estimated at £215, and it was a monster male. I calculated length and girth from a photograph with a scale item in it, but I did knock a few inches off both just to be sure, but it was certainly the biggest shark I've ever seen. For my sins, I actually have a first-class honours degree from Plymouth in marine biology, and I have a PhD in marine molecular ecology from Queen's University Belfast, for which I was fortunate to work at Plymouth Marine Laboratories during that time. PML is one of Plymouth's 3 excellent marine research centres. I've also been honoured to be involved in shark tagging both in the UK and abroad, and am the Honorary Biologist for both the Shark Angling Club of Great Britain and the SCBI, whom I thank for their unstinting support and assistance. Why collect data? That's a very valid question. And I would say the biggest threat to sharks worldwide is overfishing, largely and in huge amount from commercial interests. And a recent study has shown that over 70% decline in stocks of major shark species in the last 50 years, which is quite frightening. Whilst many countries have an active angling scientific collaborations to enable us to make decent stock decisions, the UK doesn't have an official one. And despite the great work of some charities, and I would mention the Shark Trust in this, who, despite we may have some small disagreements, I have an enormous amount of respect for the work they've done in trying to protect the species. ICAT, who actually control the tax on many migratory sharks, the total allowable catches for commercials, are often slow to act, and they often cite a lack of or even contradictory data for not reacting quickly enough. And often the data they get comes from commercial skippers, who are obviously fairly unmotivated. As we're a catch and release fishery, our data has a low impact. If we handle sharks properly, their survival post-release is excellent. We should be highly motivated participants, and we also have the advantage in the case of the UK data of actually having long-term and highly accurate data, which can't be said for many data sets. As I said before, the Shark Angling Club of Great Britain has data from 1953 to the present, mostly with an effort component in that the number of trips is accounted for. So you're not just saying, the weather affected the number of trips the number of fish we caught each year. The SACGB have also participated in several tagging studies and have contributed to many scientific papers. This illustrates something that seems neglected in the UK often, that recreational angling, along with its other benefits to health, habitat restoration and engagement with nature, etc., can be a strong force for conservation. After all, high shark numbers are in all our interests. They have an amazingly important influence on the ecosystems. However, I've come across, having a foot in both camps, significant mistrust between anglers and scientists, and hopefully some of this work will actually help to address that, which is made easier because I sort of have a foot in both camps, and I hope to illustrate the advantages of future cooperation. Right, a little bit on the biology. I'm not going to talk about length because you can probably find some of this stuff out. I'll bore you with the scientific name Proanus glauca, which comes from, the first part comes from Greek, prion, which means saw, achis, pointed, which I presume actually refers to their teeth. Glauca is then Latin for blue-grey, which hardly does credit to the vivid blue dorsal coloration of the species. These fish belong to the requiem shark family, which is the same family as the oceanic whitetip. They also have very long pectoral fins, which help these fish glide ocean currents. And despite being pretty sluggish, these sharks can actually get speeds of above 20 miles an hour when they need to. As the graph there shows, they're a relatively fast growing for a pelagic shark. Most of the fish seen in UK waters would be between about 3 to 4 years old. Females mature at about 5 years, males slightly younger, and they certainly can live for over 20 years. One of the odd things about blue sharks is during their migrations is they actually segregate for much of the year by both size, which may represent a response to some cannibalism of young fish, and also by sex, which, given how brutal sex in blue sharks is, certainly represents a wise move by the females, who have adapted an even thicker skin to cope with the amorous intent of male fish. The females gestate from between 9 to 12 months and produce large litters of an average of 25 pups, but up to a maximum of around 130, which is pretty good for a pelagic shark. When you compare this to the poor beagle, which has around 3 to 5 pups, pupping does seem to occur mainly in the open ocean, northwest of the Azores for blue sharks. Although some of the pictures provided, you can see on the right, which I believe were provided by Dan Margetts and Andy Howell, but it may be Kevin Wyatt. I can't remember quite where I got these from. It has seemed that there is some pupping occurring in waters of the southwest of the UK in more recent times. A little bit about the ecology. This is actually from some modelling data I did. Blue sharks prefer colder water than people often think. The data suggests that in the UK, they prefer water between 12 and 18.5 degrees C. They can tolerate higher temperatures and even lower temperatures. But in the UK, you can see from the sort of wavy line that above about 18.5 degrees C catches drop. And they also are very low at temperatures below about 12 degrees. However, in the tropics, they spend a lot of time at depth. So quite often they will be found down below the thermocline in the colder water, especially during the daytime. Evidence suggests that they actually spend most of their time chasing squid and other deep water prey, such as the hatchet fish, and then they follow the squid towards the surface as darkness falls. However, in UK waters, studies such as the PSAT study undertaken by the Sims lab at the MBA, which I had some involvement with via Dave Uren's boat, suggests that blues spend more time in the upper layers, especially favouring waters which are stratified. So you get sort of a uniform temperature down to a certain depth, and suddenly the depth drops off. And this is typical of sort of oceanic areas during the summer. And also they favour areas of high productivity, such as ocean and tidal fronts. This is from an Irish study, which is the other large tagging data study that's actually occurred in the Northern Hemisphere. The take home from this is blue sharks travel vast distances each year. A fish seen off the Cornish coast in August could actually be off the west coast of Africa by early winter. They broadly seem to follow the major ocean current systems. And though, as mentioned previously, migrations differ both by sex and size. You can see a little bit of that in the rather blurry picture. The females are in red and the males are in blue, but it's illustrated better in some of the later slides. It is said that they traverse the Atlantic basin in a clockwork pattern, but the evidence seems conflicting and may, as I will mention later, actually vary with environmental conditions. DNA analysis has suggested there is probably a single Atlantic stock, although the Mediterranean stock may be separate, but the methods used may actually lack the discrimination to accurately actually assess this. This rather confusing looking slide actually came from a study by Van der Peer et al., but from fish tagged in the Azores, and it shows how the fish segregate by both size and sex and only converge for a short period between February and April in the Central Atlantic. The red colours you can see represent the large juvenile female fish we see, and the beige colours mature females. As you can see during this study, the sharks that are found off the UK shelf during the summer were predominantly immature females, as the Shark Angling Club study confirms. And these fish migrate between here and the waters off the mid-North Atlantic. However, as these female fish get larger, they spend more time in the southern waters off the west coast of Africa. However, conclusions from this study should be considered as a snapshot only, as they were conducted over a relatively short time period. And as we'll see later, things change with time. Here's some real data. This is actually from the Shark Angling Club's tagging study, which the data is courtesy of the Shark Angling Club, Dr. King Collins of the NOC, and Dr. John Mitchell, who's currently in Western Australia. In total, 1,440 tags were applied between 1998 and 2011, of which there were 99 returns. That represents us what sounds a pitiful 6.8%, but actually it varied a lot between years, with nearly 14% returns seen in the early years of this study, which may represent a number of factors such as heavy commercial pressure, low stock numbers, or just bloody good advertising for the program. The average time at liberty for a shark was 426 days, although one particular female that was of mature size at tagging was recaptured over 18 years later, which probably means that fish was over 23 years old when she was finally recaught. On average, the fish were recaptured nearly 1,900 miles away from the point of first capture, and with the nearest only a few miles away by another loose shark boat about 2 days later, whilst the furthest was recaptured off the south coast of Venezuela over 4,000 miles away. Given a straight line speed, which is hugely not true, because obviously these fish ain't just going to go, right, I'm going to go in one direction and head off. The speeds of these fish per day varied between 0.19 and 28 miles per day, with one fish being recaptured after 80 days of freedom off the coast of Maine. This is a bit of stuff on size. Overall, as you can see, the fishery was dominated by female fish. And this was actually over 94% female during this study, and the size of the tagged fish varied, the smallest being around 35 inches, which is a real pup, and the biggest at 107 inches. Only 8.6% of females and 6.92% of females were considered mature, which for this study was considered to be over 86 inches. There was considerable differences between the mean length between years. The highest mean length was seen in 2009 and the lowest in 2011. For the entire data set for the southwest of the UK since 2005, there is an inverse relationship between the size and number of fish. So the years where we've seen vastly increased numbers were generally led by smaller specimens, although perversely some of the biggest fish were actually seen during those years. It is also possible to generate some really good growth data from this, which I won't bore you with the mathematics of. But the maximum theoretical size, which is a theoretical average size, was around 10 foot for our waters. And the maximum theoretical age, again, it's done from an equation, was over 23 years. These results were in line with other studies from the North Atlantic, but were slightly different to studies done earlier in the UK. Right, this is going to horrify anyone who knows anything about oceanography, but it's an overlay of the main currents, of the North Atlantic. It's incredibly, it is amazingly inaccurate, but it gives you a general idea. Broadly speaking, the fish seem to follow the major ocean current systems, and recaptures were mostly in areas of upwellings, shelves, or even seamounts. But of course, this may just represent where the longliners fish for swordfish. Most, something like 98% of recaptures were by longliners. Generally, the fish recaptured off Africa were indeed larger females, as we noted before. So, right, nice and easy. This looks really, really simple. These fish follow these nice, easy current systems in a nice, predictable manner. But the following slide. This is actually a slide of real current systems, and which obviously is neither simple. And also, there's a video on the NOAA site if you want to see it. This is actually the Gulf Stream, the Caribbean current, various other current systems. You can see the eddies. They vary over time. They vary over space. And as with much of nature, especially with that of an animal that wanders so widely, the story is rarely that simple. So that, with my Welsh rugby ball, my shark, is half time. So have a break. And has anyone got any questions?
Yes, Simon. I think there's a bit of an issue with the text box in terms of chat box, in terms of people asking questions. But I have got one that I've seen that has come up, which is from Dave Wilkins. Is the commercial fishing industry a threat from bycatch, or are the sharks targeted specifically?
Mainly, the evidence that I've seen is that most of the sharks are a bycatch. Certainly, that would take them within Europe. I can't answer for the Far Eastern boats, which may deliberately actually target them. A lot of the blue sharks are actually caught as part of the swordfish fishery.
Okay, Simon, I can't see any other questions specifically. So if everybody's happy, I think Hannah's got issues being able to actually see the text box as well, but I can see that we have got a hand up. So I will invite somebody, if you're okay with that, Simon. Tim Rowds has got a question. Tim, if you can turn your microphone on.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, yep. That's good.
Okay, cool. I've noted that the blue sharks that have been caught in UK waters over the last few years have been relatively small. There's been a lot of small fish, and you talked there about migration routes. Does that mean that the sharks throughout the Atlantic are of a similar size?
Not necessarily. There was thought, and it's still valid, that there was a sort of a nursery area for sort of sub-adult fish that extended from sort of southwest of the Bay of Biscay up to the UK waters, and it sort of contracts and expands depending on various years. And that may be my theory. I'll go into some of this more a little bit later. I will say in the last few years that there have been a lot of small fish, but there have also been fish far bigger than we've ever seen before in this country. There's also seen an increase in male fish, which generally tolerate higher temperatures and lower temperatures than females. I'm not sure if that answers you at all.
Okay, I've got a question as well. I've found a couple of other written questions here, Simon, so if you can bear with me. You can still hear me at the moment, can't you?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. So this is from Steve Murphy. The angler-led data you've gathered is huge. Who else is gathering this data, and what can anglers do to help you on this in the future?
In the UK, I mean, various organisations have made efforts to get the data, but there is reluctance, understandably, amongst skippers to hand this stuff over. You know, it's their lifeline, and there have been instances where data's been used poorly, I would say, and has adversely affected anglers. So there's a reluctance. NOAA would be the big one I'd go for in the States. NOAA has a fantastic data set, but a lot of its tagging data, there isn't as much actual catch effort data, which I'll talk about soon. There's also the Campana Lab in Canada, which has records from the shark festivals in the US, which have the advantage that a lot of these fish are killed, which we just don't do over here. There's also a South African scheme that does other sharks that's supposed to be very good. But you have a look at the ICAT data, and an awful lot of it is derived from commercial fisheries, and it's very conflicting. The Irish data set, what I'd say, would be the other really good one.
Okay, Simon, a couple of others then that I've got is, or they're just starting to be typed in now, and I've found them. Okay, one is off topic. What chance a great white shark off of Cornwall, given its ability to tolerate relatively colder water, as these are found in the Mediterranean, so it's not far to come, is it?
I would never say never, and I suspect they have visited our waters, and I suspect they will again. Given their relative rarity nowadays, the chances are probably less, but some people have given me a very convincing accounts of seeing them recently. I've never personally seen one, but I wouldn't rule it out. But I would be surprised if it was common, but I would like to be proved wrong.
Okay, couple of others I've got here. Relative to skippers not wanting to hand over the data, over, does Brexit not change this, i.e. data not being fed back to the EU?
Actually not. I'm very fortunate this data goes directly to ICAT. I bypass DEFRA, I bypass CFAS. This data goes directly to who use it. I've got no interest in, I said at the start of it that I would collect this data to try and do some good, and I'm trying to give it to the people who can actually do some good with it.
Okay, what I'm going to do is one more of the written ones, and I'll go to a couple of the people with hands up. So if you just bear with me, Simon. What chances are there of blues appearing in the Eastern English Channel off of Sussex, for instance, or is that likely?
They certainly have been off the coast of Sussex. I remember boats fishing for them in mid to late 70s. I don't think they caught many. In general, the dividing line for the eastern penetration of them is around about start point. It depends very much on the Ushant tidal front, the position of it. They are reluctant to go into water that's tidally mixed. Yep. They prefer water that's oceanic stratified water. They do go across, they may chase prey, but they are less likely to. They do occur in Lyme Bay. I think they are less likely to be found further east, but in certain conditions, I'm sure, and there's probably the same thing with the bluefin tuna, they will go further east. I mean, I'd look for deeper water and warm weather.
Okay, Simon, look, I've got two more here that I think is fair to give people a chance to do, and then if you're happy to crack on with part two. So the first one, Tim Rowds, if you can unmute and want to ask your question, please.
Already asked and answered.
Okay, thank you. Okay, and the last one, Ali Hood then. Ali, if you'd like to unmute.
Might I just add a comment on whether blue shark are bycatch targets in the ICAT
Please
fisheries?
do. You probably know more than I do about that, Ali.
Sorry, Simon, can you hear me at the moment? Because I've got strange headphones issues. Nevin, can you hear?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, that's fantastic.
Yep,
thank you. So the Shark Trust are observers to ICAT and are closely involved in the blue shark fisheries that these vessels undertake. Sharks, that's predominantly blue shark and mako, make up 80% of the ICAT swordfish and tuna fisheries, and about 70% of that is blue shark. Historically, they've been referenced as bycatched, but the Spanish and Portuguese fleets will clearly state these are a target fishery. They represent the economic viability of this fleet as the swordfish numbers have plummeted and more management has come in place for swordfish. So just recently, there's been changes to the convention text within ICAT, which allows or will soon allow sharks to be seen as target species. Strangely, within ICAT, well, not strangely, within the ICAT convention text, if you are a tuna-like species, you are not considered a convention text species, which means that you cannot actually be a target fishery. Saying that, they have now set a TAC in 2019, And so this recognises the target nature of the blue shark fishery in the Atlantic, which makes it all the more important that data that Simon's discussing tonight is included in the stock assessment processes. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ali.
Okay, Simon, I think at that point, if you're happy to crack on with part two, just something that I've picked up, and I think a couple of others have, Simon, is just in the bottom right-hand side of your screen, we've still got that little grey box. Is that something you're able to get rid of, or is it just
gone?
It's gone now? Yeah, if you could, that's great. Thank you.
Sorry, it pops up from now and again.
Okay, and we're going to try. Hopefully, Hannah will be able to pick up the questions in after the second part, but I'll keep monitoring as well. So thank you for that.
Okay, then. Well, I'll crack on. During the second half, I want to talk about some real catch data and what it can and what it can't tell us. I want to also talk about how catch data doesn't also always equal stock levels. And as I said, with a highly migratory fish, this is actually really important. I also want to try and link changes to shark numbers we see in the UK with bigger changes we see in the Atlantic Ocean. I want to pose the question, has the shark population recovered? And if so, why? That's quite a big question, as you can imagine. And then I will summarise what we've talked about a bit, and then I'll take more questions if that's okay. I'd just like to make say a word about the database, which is named after the very famous shark angler Pat Smith, who's seen here with her son. I was very privileged to meet her a couple of years ago at an event down in Loo. She still is, I believe, the IGFA official £130 class record holder for poor beagles. And I had a lovely chat with her, and she was absolutely wonderful. And we named this the database that represents the collaboration between the Shark Angling Club of Great Britain, the SCBI, Charter Skippers, et al. After her. We're very lucky. It includes data from ports along the south coast, from Lyme Regis to Penzance. The largest contributor to the data set are actually the Shark Angling Club of Great Britain, followed by myself via my work on Mirage and on my own private boats. And then I must mention Chippy from Penzance, who has an amazing database set that he's actually allowed me to use, and a huge thanks for him for doing that. There are many other skippers who have started providing data, and you know, it's a massive thing they're doing, and I really appreciate it. It now represents the second largest database of blue shark captures in the world after NOAA. Records over 102,000 captures dating back to 1953, and as I said before, includes effort data for most of that period. Since 1998, the detail of the data has improved. With my own contributions, we have very accurate effort data down to the hours and minutes, and also decent position data if we want to do more complex analysis. I have done more complex analysis that compensates for things like different ports, you know, months, lots of different factors, but for convenience sake, I don't want to bore you too much with that. I'm going to include the main part of the data, which is from the Shark Angling Club of Great Britain data. So here it is. A continuous yearly average of blue shark captures with effort adjusted from the SACGB data from 1953 to 2019. You can very obviously see that the initial high concentrations of catches decreased in the early 1960s, and despite the odd better year, never really increased to these levels until 2010 onwards. So is that right? Is that really a representation of the stock? Well, not quite. I just want to give you a quick example. So put in individual years. The blue bar you can actually see on the left-hand side represents the coldest winter that we actually had in the last, I think it was 200 odd years, which coincided with some interesting long-term climatic variations. And the red bar represents a dip in catches that was also associated with a very, very warm summer. So it's obvious from this that the environment changes the number of fish we catch. Just some data from other people's studies. Vass in 1990 showed that shark captures were highly temperature dependent, especially the temperature in the spring months. So temperatures in March and April actually influenced how many sharks we would catch during that year. Mitchell et al. In 2016 showed that the level of algae in the water and the presence of mature tidal fronts, so these areas where two water masses meet, and that's being really basic and not giving a great deal of understanding, influenced the distribution of sharks, especially the local distribution of sharks. But my interest was really about what about longer environmental changes and how these affect how changes that affect the ocean, even thousands of miles away, could they possibly actually affect the number of sharks we see in the UK? Surprisingly, this is, if you see the top graph there, it's actually comparing, that's really the global warming signature. That's temperature anomalies taken from the E1 site, which fortunately sits virtually smack bang in the middle of where Lou fish for the sharks. On the y-axis is the shark catch per unit effort. You can see there doesn't seem to be an obvious relationship. And on the wider yearly level, there also doesn't seem to be a relationship between the mean chlorophyll A, so the amount of algae over the whole year, between that and shark captures. But this is, the Vass and so showed that there was a sort of local effect. But obviously there are lots and lots of other information that may actually affect these. It's easier to predict year effects than it is like what one person is going to catch on a particular day. So it looks like the things like the amount of algae in the water and the temperature affects more like the local distribution rather than actually any migration patterns. I must thank Dr. Paul Summerfield from PML and Dr. Tim Smythe for actually providing this data, which is really kind of them. Some environmental changes. Right, now we're going to talk about, I'm really sorry about some of these words, I didn't make them up. This shows the relationship between the catches we saw before and the very, very beautifully named Atlantic multi-decadal variation. Now, I use the word variation because oceanographers have told me off for using the more conventional term, which is oscillation, which is effectively a climatic variation that changes over decades, and is in effect differences in the sea surface temperature when all the other factors, including climate change, have been excluded. There does seem to be some correlation in patches between this orange line and the blue line, which is shark numbers, but it's far from consistent or obvious. Interestingly, the relationship of the return of bluefin tuna to UK waters and the AMV has also been postulated in a previous paper. There is some controversy around this regarding the measure they actually used of the AMV, and also the way they collated the data from different time periods. But it was a very interesting paper. However, this is Holiday et al., who is an oceanographer from Southampton, presented a fascinating paper on freshening events in the North Atlantic. And it seemed to provide some sort of plausible explanation for a relationship I'd noted between low salinity events in the North Atlantic and the explosion in blue shark numbers seen in the mid-2010, specifically 2014, 2015. As you can see, in a lot of places, there is quite an interesting relationship going on there, especially in patches. These changes are actually in the middle of the North Atlantic. So why would changes in the salinity in the North Atlantic actually have any effect on shark numbers seen thousands of miles away? Right, I'm afraid I'm going to have to. Why would this happen? Well, the most likely reason would seem to be that it would actually involve with the currents in the North Atlantic. And to try and explain this relationship, I'm afraid I'm going to have to do a bad job of teaching some oceanography, for which I apologise in advance to any oceanographers in the audience. The diagram on the right, as opposed to wind-driven currents and tides, obviously which are due to gravity, the gravity of the moon and the sun, the thermohaline circulation is the part of the ocean circulation that is driven by density differences. Seawater density is dependent mainly on two factors, temperature and salinity, hence the name thermohaline. The salinity and temperature differences arise from heating and cooling at the sea surface and from surface freshwater fluxes, i.e. the amount of evaporation from the ocean, sea ice formation. As sea ice forms, the ice drops out, makes it more saline. The amount of rain there is, runoff from land, and even things like ice melt, actually decrease the salinity. So if you look here, you can see the way the AMOC, or the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, as it's known, I'm going to call it AMOC from now in, actually it's a sort of conveyor belt where warm water from the south heads northwards with concurrently strong evaporation, and as it rapidly cools, suddenly becomes more dense, and as it becomes more dense, it sinks. As it sinks to the bottom, is then drawn southwards by the North Atlantic deep water, and it's the sort of conveyor belt that drives things like the Gulf Stream. So basically, changes in salinity in the North Atlantic alter the strength of this AMOC and affect the various associated currents. The illustration in the next slide will actually hopefully show this better, but the top slide on the right-hand side there, the blue area indicates the event of 2014-2015. Blue area is very low salinity. So a freshening event, and it was the most extreme seen for 150 years. It was also accompanied by very high saline events off the coast of Canada, which can be seen by the orange marks in that graph towards the coast of America. So salinity changes can actually affect the strength and position of the currents. Again, this is a graph adapted from Holiday et al. 2020, and I really thank them. In graph A, the differences in the amount of wind stress between the Arctic Atlantic and more lower latitudes leads to a negative salinity anomaly off the southeast of Canada and enhances the Labrador Current, which in turn strengthens the northern arm of the North Atlantic Current, as can be seen on graph B, the little red line going up there. This seems to result in less blue sharks in UK waters. When we see an increase in blue shark numbers, it seems to be due to, as we've seen in graph C, more heat loss and increased rainfall in the same areas in the northern waters, which leads to a high salinity event off Canada and very low salinity in the mid-Atlantic. This results in the slowing of the northern arm of the North Atlantic Current and a consequent strengthening of the southern arm, which of course is closer to the UK. So, if this is true, and numbers of sharks that reach our waters may not always be directly related to stock levels, how can we compensate? The answer, again, is our friend modelling. That strange black box that governments rely on for COVID advice, which in this case is much easier as we have loads of data from a long time period than the government find it. In this case, I've used generalized additive modeling called GAM, which you probably don't care about. But in effect, it takes out each effect and combinations of those effects and tries to just leave the differences in shark numbers between years, which should, in theory, better represent changes in stocks. In the model, the salinity changes in the North Atlantic explained an amazing 24.5% of the variation in blue shark numbers in the UK. Whilst the AMV and also the North Atlantic oscillation, which is basically the pressure difference between the Azores high and the Iceland low, which affects the weather that comes to us, both about 4.5%. However, when you look closely at the data, as that very awful graph at the bottom actually does show, I couldn't find a better one of doing it, you can actually see that the AMV, the effect of the AMV may actually be related, but it may be delayed. So in fact, what happens in the AMV 10 years ago might affect shark numbers in the UK now. Sorry about that, got a problem with my slide. So this is the big graph. If I take all the other factors off and just have the between year captures, this is what it looks like. So I've tried to remove as many factors as I could. I by no means have removed all of them, and there will be many other factors that influence it, but it does try and standardize it more. The red lines indicate a significant reduction in shark catches. That's a statistically significant between years, and the blue lines indicate significant increases. It does show a decrease, which was gradual at times and significant at other times, until the 1970s, followed by a very steep decline. There was a brief surge in the late 1980s and early 2000s. Followed by a steep decline again in the early 2000s, and levels at that time were the lowest that's actually been seen in this country. I mean, there was a month in September in 2000. Despite many trips, there was not a single blue shark caught out of Loo during the whole month. The data suggests that there has been an increase since the mid-2000s, but, and I'll make this a big but, which I'm sure other shark researchers would agree with, this would need to be confirmed with other data sources before any concrete conclusions could be made. So, has the global blue shark stocks recovered? Maybe. I'm hopeful, but what we can say with some certainty is the number of fish reaching the UK in recent summers has increased. And the data does seem similar to that collected by the Irish recreational tagging programme, but the other data that I've seen from ICAT is hugely contradictory. Why might a recovery occur? Well, if I'm being hopeful, has the long line pressure decreased, and has the limits on finning had an effect? Probably not. Has predation decreased? That's an interesting one, because very unfortunately the stocks of one of the blue shark's major predators, the mako, are in a perilous position. And NOAA data suggests that the mako sharks are in the same area, or certainly were in the same area, when the blue sharks were pupping, and at the same time. Were they due to increases in prey distribution? Well, interestingly, blue shark and mackerel numbers correlate really well, but blue shark numbers in the UK correlate for mackerel caught in the summer between Norway and Iceland, so figure that one out. That probably suggests a common cause, which may be the salinity, it may be something else. However, both anchovy and pilchard numbers have returned to the southwest, and in large amounts. Unfortunately, accurate data isn't available for this ICES area for these species, but judging by the number of ring netters and other vessels that are fishing for them, and anecdotal stuff and the stuff we've seen, they certainly have returned. Interestingly, the recent surge in blue shark numbers in the UK has coincided with the return of bluefin tuna. Certainly the recent one has, and even possibly thresher sharks, which suddenly we've seen again after an absence of an awful lot of years. There is some indication of recovery in the poor beagle numbers recently, but this is probably more due to the zero TAC for the species, commercial TAC. It's very hard to actually make anything of that. However, I would say that ecology is a very slippery beast, and rarely does one factor explain the fate of a species. And I would say that is especially true for one such as the blue shark that travels quite so far. So what do we learn? Well, people knew this one before. Blue sharks follow huge annual migrations. However, these migrations might not be as predictable as you think, and they may vary from year to year. Historically, the UK has mainly caught immature females. However, this changes over space and time, and we certainly have seen an increase in mature males over the last few years, and also some truly awesome, truly incredibly large females. We've shown that long-term catch data is valuable. Hopefully, I've indicated that angling is a very good source for this data. Also, I've shown that stuff that happens a long way away can affect shark numbers in the UK. It certainly seems to affect blue shark numbers, and maybe it affects other species as well. Hopefully, I've shown that what we catch here may not equal what the actual stock of the species is. It's something we've definitely got to be aware of, but there are certainly more blue sharks in the UK in the last few years than certainly there were when I first started fishing for them. I'd like to say there's a stock recovery, and I'm hopeful, but without ICAT doing their further modelling and stuff like that with multiple data sources, it's probably too early to say that. So, full time, and I'd like to ask if anyone's got any questions. Okay,
Simon. I've got a few here. I'm going to hand over to Hannah in a minute, but I've just got one that's come in, and it's Dave Mitchell's asked, have we got any skippers or anglers in the audience who would like to share their catch data, and for them either to contact yourself, Simon, or to contact us. That's Dave Mitchell via the Angling Trust, and you can also do it through myself. I can pass that on. So if there is anybody in the audience, please, who are skippers or anglers who've got data that they could share, I'm sure you would appreciate that, Simon, as well.
Yeah, I'd just like to make it very clear that on all this data, I ask every skipper if they are prepared to share it for every project. This isn't just handed over. If the skipper doesn't want to share it for some things and does throw it, that's fine. I exclude it from the analysis. It's their data. I just ask permission to use it.
Okay, thank you. Look, what I'll do now, Simon, is I'll hand over to Hannah, who'll go through the questions that people have been typing. And what I'm then going to do is, once Hannah's finished those, if anybody's got questions that they would then like to ask, if they can raise their hand in the participants box, and I will then come back in after Hannah's done hers. So, Hannah, are you unmuted and ready to go?
Yes, thank you, Nevin,
okay.
and thank you, Simon, for a great presentation. We've had some awesome questions sent through from the audience, so thank you for those. So to kick things off, we have one from Keith Rogers, who's asked, what is the closest observed sighting to Devon and Cornwall coastline? If you know, Simon.
What, for any shark, or for what, for blue sharks?
I'm assuming so. It's not referenced to species, but I'm assuming blue sharks.
I've seen one in Plymouth Sound.
Wow.
Okay.
I've also seen bluefin tuna in Plymouth Sound.
So next question is from Mark, and he asks, could you give us an idea of how the UK taupe stocks are doing at the moment?
That's a very difficult question. I recently have seen some tagging data on taupe. I haven't had time to go through it. I will say that taupe is, I believe it's either listed as an endangered or critically endangered species for a wider area. I'm afraid I don't have any data on that at the moment, but I can certainly get back to you on that.
Thank you. Steve Murphy asks, the divergence between the AMV and catch per unit effort adjusted captures between 1998 and 2010 is similar to what we've seen in Atlantic bluefin. In the case of Atlantic bluefin tuna, this is well documented to have coincided with imploding stock levels over that period. Is this likely to have been similar with blue sharks and commercial pressures upon them in that period?
Possibly. I'd say the one thing that's very noticeable with the AMV data is the lag. I'd like to know why there's that lag. Is it a question of the biology of the species? You know, is it the generation time? Are you seeing changes in that? Are they redistributing the species, making them less likely to get caught by certain species? Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I'm not sure I fully know the answer to that one, though.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Simon. David Young has asked, will these causal effects driving the increase in blue sharks have the same positive effect on other major shark species in the UK? Will the bluefin tuna have any impact, positive or negative, on the development of the blue shark fishery in coming years?
There are some hopeful signs that things like threshers are returning. Some of the threshers seen amongst the bluefin tuna are bigger than ever recorded in the UK before. I'm not hopeful about makos. There was a massive mako caught off Wales this year. That's very much an anomaly, and I'd love to know where it came from. But I've been fortunate enough to see 2 makos jumping around in my life. I've never put a hook in one, but I'm not sure I'm going to see another one in our waters. There are other sharks we may well see in the UK waters. There are things like the ragged-toothed sand tiger, which has recently been reported off the northern French coast on several occasions. I think there are other things out there like six gills that Kevin Mackey's recently found in various places, and which we probably just didn't know were there. Oceanic white tips, there's no reason why you shouldn't get them there. They probably have been here, but I think the stocks of them are quite low at the moment. I'm sorry, what was the other part of the question, Hannah?
It was, that's fascinating, by the way, and will the bluefin tuna have any impact, positive or negative, on the development of the blue shark fishery in coming years?
Certainly the bluefins are around towards the later side of the shark season, so they tend to be here after towards the end. I think they were here mid-August. It was quite early. I mean, off Plymouth, we don't tend to see them till September, maybe October, depending on the years. It tends to be at the end of the season. Bluefin tuna, certainly, it's not known what the effects of bluefin tuna on the ecosystem would be. It's known that because they run hot, they run hotter than water temperature. They do eat quite a lot. We don't really know how many bluefin tuna are out there. I mean, we've got a lot of sightings data, but sightings data for a species that travels that quickly is pretty useless. We don't really have an effective handle on the number actually of the species around here to be able to make any sort of ecosystem models and then to sort of try and understand the effects they might have on other species.
Thank you. The next one is from David Wilkins, who asks, is the salinity an effect on shark prey species or on preference for waters by the sharks or perhaps currents?
It's been, the most likely explanation is that currents have got a lot to do with it. There is also the possibility blue sharks don't like coastal waters particularly. They won't come close inshore to Plymouth if there's been a lot of rainwater coming out of the Tamar. There is possibly, if they're actually up in the water, this effect is quite shallow. They just won't cross that boundary. It's also possible that water's cold. But yeah, there is this. It seems the mackerel data seems to indicate that the mackerel have changed their habits at the same time. I only have mackerel data from ICES going back to around, I think I have it going back to about sort of 1980, so I don't have full comparison. As I said, the data seems to indicate that actually at the moment the mackerel are in a completely different place to the blue sharks, but the anecdotal data indicates that probably other prey species, which the bluefin are probably more happy chasing, are more prevalent now.
Thanks. Then the next one is from Sean Leonard, who asks, has capture efficiency any part in the apparent increase in, is capture efficiency any part in the apparent increase in catches this century? And presumably the boats are better geared and more refined and targeted in their approach. So is this having an influence?
It's certainly something that needs to be considered in the models. It's certainly considered in commercial models, and as people know, there will be skippers that some skippers are better than others. There'll be some ports that are better than others. Our gear is much better than it used to be back in the 1950s, and probably the boats didn't go so far. So there will certainly be an element of that in there.
Okay. Kevin Woodcock asks, co-running a charter boat off the northeast coast, is there any research being carried out in this area or planned for the northeast?
Northeast coast of England.
I assume so. Hasn't referenced a country, but I'm assuming northeast of England.
The only data I've seen from the northeast of England was some limited data on poor beagle tagging. I know there's certainly porgies there. I don't know about other sharks. This stuff isn't planned. It's not. This is data I've got because I happen to live down here. It's not funded or anything. I haven't heard of anything, I must admit. I personally think that a long-term tagging study would be a good idea, but it needs to be done properly throughout the UK. It needs to be done properly for the right reasons. People need to be trained, and it needs to be long-term to be of any use.
Great, thank you. Adrian Piotrowski, which I'm hoping I've said that right, has said, has survival rate after catch and release been calculated, and how reliable do you believe the data to be?
I have some. There's a lot of data in tropical areas on blue sharks from long lines. The data shows that due to the different ventilation systems used by the different sharks, blues fare better on long lines than species like bald beagles or makos if they're actually released. I have some limited data from the UK, and what I will say is that if you handle a blue shark correctly, its survival is excellent. If you don't, it isn't. I would go to the Shark Angling Club and the Shark Trust handling guides for a starter. That would be where I'd look at. That would be my advice. But yeah, post-release mortality, there may be another study coming up. I said there was limited data in the UK. You can actually see the effects of things like circle hooks when you look at the Shark Angling Club data. You can see skippers who use circle hooks had a significantly better return rate than those who didn't. So draw your own conclusions.
Thank you. Martin asks, are the cause and effect you describe acting directly on the shark, or do they affect prey which the shark follow?
Probably a bit of both. Yeah, it's as I said, ecology is slippery. There probably is an effect on the. It would seem likely that there is some change to the migration route of these fish, but it would also, they'd only come here if there was food. Whether they consider pilchard to be an easier prey than a mackerel, I don't know, or whether it's just coincidental the mackerel have moved away. I'm not sure, but it is quite surprising. The one thing I will say is that sharks are often in the Plymouth waters at times where there are very few obvious prey fish we can catch. And even sometimes I've known them to actually go down below the thermocline and feed on whiting.
Thanks, Simon. We've just got the last few questions now. So Alan's asked, is it reasonable to suppose that water turbidity could be a factor in distribution?
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. The algae question isn't quite as simple as you think. One of the slides I've shown, up to a certain amount, algae is sort of related to productivity in the water. So if you've got if you've got algae there, you've got zooplankton a bit later, you'll then get small fish or then get bigger fish. But if it's things like dinoflagellates, that's a no-go. If you see red slime on your line, you won't see a shark. I think the month I talked about, September in 2000, was characterised off Loo by severe Karenia bloom, and the water just looked black, and there wasn't a shark anywhere near it. So blue, definitely, if you're going to, I mean, it's no great secret. I use a lot of satellite imagery for finding blue sharks. I look for frontal areas where two water masses meet, the edges of temperature changes, things like that. But yeah, turbidity. So I would say, it's completely clear water, probably hasn't got a lot of life in it. A little bit of colour, okay. Really, really dirty water, sharks ain't going to be able to see it. If you've got red algae in the water, they're not going to be anywhere near it.
Well, thank you. So we've got a question related to algae here. So you might have already kind of answered it with your response. And Mark's asked, could salinity affect the algae, hence the small fish that eat it up, and so up the food chain?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one of the interesting things, though, is that when you look at the actual salinity in the water off Plymouth, where we're getting these sharks, you can't really see much of a difference. It's actually these events that are causing current changes. As I've noted before, though, if you get a high rain event, the sharks won't come in close. You can see, because the way fresh water sits over the top of salt water as it comes out of a river, and these sharks are often quite shallow. If you get a lot of river water coming out of the Tamar, blue sharks tend to push off a bit further.
Great, thank you. And the last question from the written chat is, with 300 plus interested people on this forum, there is clearly group interest in trying to do something to protect sharks in and out of the UK waters. What is the plan here or strategy to leverage this level of support?
Long term, the plan is to effectively get the data distributed amongst is to get everyone working together. There are short-term issues which I'd like to overcome, and we are working in some small way with the Angling Trust to try and do this. I don't, it's very hard to convince a skipper by phoning them up that they should hand their data over. And a lot of the work has been done by people like John Mack, who have personally contacted them. It's done by chatting with people in pubs. It's done by it takes a lot of effort to actually get, quite rightly, hold of this data, and I think there is a misunderstanding there's a mistrust between anglers and scientists on a lot of occasions, and it sort of works both ways, because as a scientist, I know the restrictions that a lot of these institutes are under when they do a project, and it must be very frustrating as an angler because you can't understand why you can't do what you want to do. I've got the advantage, I'm an independent scientist, so I don't answer to any institutions, and I'm not doing any sort of animal experimentation work, I'm observing. So, but long term, I would love to see a wider number of people actually providing data for this data set. I'd like to see it taken onwards. I'd like to be, it seems, used for as many things as it possibly can. And I'd like to collect as much information as I can. And if researchers come to us and say, you want to do this and want to do that, we go back to the people who provided that data and say, do you want us to do it? That's how I see it.
Brilliant. Thanks, Simon. I'm going to pass over to Nevin now for any hands up questions to take from the audience.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you, Hannah, and thank you, Simon. So I've got just a couple that we'll go through here, Simon, if that's okay with you. I think the first one was from Luke Evans. Luke, if you can unmute your microphone and ask Simon.
Just a quick question. Is there any, do you notice any difference in the size of sharks, numbers of sharks from different ports in the UK? It's sort of an ongoing discussion I've had with a few friends between, different populations of Celtic deeps, perhaps those coming out of Loo compared to Penzance, etc.
It depends on year to year. You can, what I will say from the data, you can track certain fish as they move between ports. You can see patterns. When you have a big enough data set, you can see patterns. If I haven't got, unfortunately, I haven't got a picture of it, but the way the Ushant tidal front works, there's actually sort of, it comes around, curves around, if you imagine to start point, sort of, you know, on the sort of eastern side of Devon, but there's also a shortcut that sort of goes straight across to Penzance, and then it sort of goes up offshore from the north coast of Cornwall, and then sort of joins on with the Celtic front, which you'll be familiar with. I mean, the Celtic front's another classic area you're going to get sharks. I mean, you've got two water bodies meet. But you can certainly, I haven't got any data from the Celtic front. I would love to, I haven't got any. But I can certainly see if they catch a certain caliber of fish in Penzance, you will often, or you know, we catch them in Devon, they will often see them a few days or a few weeks later in another port, and it's particularly obvious with male fish.
Okay, thank you for that. And the last one from Don Webb. Dom, are you there?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead.
Hi. Just to follow on a little bit from Paul's question about what the strategy is. Everything so far has talked about skippers, which kind of infers, I would imagine, people who are running charters. There's an aspect of that's their profession and so on and so forth. Is there scope here? And I'm just conscious of the charts that you showed us about how far north and towards the UK the blue sharks get. Is there scope here for regular Joe angler who maybe has a small boat or is shore-based fishing? Is there scope for them to fit within the ability to sort of provide data, to provide sightings, catch reports, things like that? Or realistically, would the numbers of catches or data reports be too small?
Not at all. I do use data provided from small boat anglers around here. I use them from my own small boat. If it's reliable data, I'll use it. I will say I do have a bullshit statistic that if somebody gives me data that's obviously so far away from anyone else, I won't accept it. But yeah, I would love to extend it to other species, to other areas, and to recreational anglers. But to be honest, this is not, I don't get paid for this. This is something that has probably taken me the amount of effort I did to do my PhD. I'm hard pushed to push this past blue sharks at the moment. So, but I think this sort of thing's hugely valuable. If you've got blue shark data, yeah, brilliant. I mean, we are talking with other people to try and address this. I will say that.
I would say this doesn't appear to be, I would say, something that's unique to blue sharks. I would imagine this is I suppose my question is probably very generic to, well, fish in the sea, full stop.
No, and I think people like DEFRA have tried through their angling diaries and things like that. I mean, I don't know what the uptake is. I've been very specific. I do have some data on some other sharks. It's incidental. I haven't done anything with it so far. I haven't really, really had time to do anything with it. But I think there's some very interesting questions, as one of the earlier commenters made about taupe. I mean, that's a species that is around the UK. Smooth hands, another species that have fascinated me. That's obviously had a resurgence, certainly, from a time when I used to see fish 25 years ago. They first started to appear in big numbers in Sussex. Now, you look at the UK distribution of them. I think there's an awful lot. These sort of non-target species is something that DEFRA and CFAS don't really have a handle on. And I think really, it's the sort of thing we should be filling the void for, in absence of any sort of initiative that's going to work. but it has to be. I can't, you know, as I said, I haven't got the time to do much more than blue shark stuff at the moment, I'm afraid.
Am I right in saying that this is an issue of organisation, as in you just don't have the time, the resources to organise this, and if somebody else could, there would be value there?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, it needs to be controlled. We can't, you know, that it needs to be controlled and it needs to be of value. There needs to be some standards on the data we collect. It needs to be useful. You know, collecting data for data's sake's waste of time. I mean, but I'm lucky. I don't need really. I've got a long time series. I need relatively simple data. There's a lot of very interesting stuff you could do, you know, around by actually accurately sizing some of these smaller sharks. You know, things I'm reluctant to do with the bigger sharks. And though we're looking at other ways of doing it rather than just taking them out of the water, there's some really valuable stuff that could be done, and it probably should be.
Cool. All right.
Okay.
Thanks. It was a great presentation. Thank you.
No problem.
Okay, well, Simon, thank you so much, and thank you for the questions, both written and the direct ones that we've been able to put tonight. Thank you for your time, Simon. What I'm going to do, hand over to David in a minute, but if I could just make a few points for everybody. As we're recording this, I'm going to apologise now that some people have had connection issues trying to get in. We have been able to let some people in. And for anybody who hasn't been able to get in, who will be watching this video, again, my apologies, but we are trying to, you know, it's the first time it's a learning experience for us with this, please. So we will be putting this onto YouTube, and what we are going to be doing as well is hopefully we'll be moving to webinar-based presentations soon as well, and that will hopefully mean that less people have problems in terms of getting in. Can I just flag up to everybody as well, if you've enjoyed Simon's presentation tonight, the 11th of March, stick that in your diary, because we are looking at an input from Dr. Georgia Jones and Bryce Stewart on UK recreational shark angling science, and the spotlight on pool beagles. So pool beagles is going to be what we're looking at then. And we're hoping to continue with some other shark themed work as we go through the year as well. So that would be great. And obviously, if there's anything that you'd like Simon to come back and talk to us about, I'm sure we could invite Simon back again if he was willing to do so. If I can flag up just two other things, please. As I said, this is the first of our themed forums. We will be looking at another one next week, and I know a number of you, I've heard comments and seen comments about the Devon and Cornwall interest. We are working around the coast on a month-by-month basis with invitations to each of our IFCAs, who will be presenting starting next week on the 25th with Cornwall IFCA. Then we're moving on to Devon and Severn, and basically along the coast, finishing up in the northwest towards the end of the year. So please keep an eye out for those. They'll be going out again. As David said, if you haven't signed up for the free newsletter, please do that. And what would be really good as well, you know, feedback's always important for us, and I'll be sending some details out of how you can do that for us, please. But the other thing is, you know, we're really minded to you know, that engagement with sea anglers is really important to us. So tell us, what else would you like to see covered? Doesn't have to be sharks. It could be any topic area. We'll try and look at some appropriate speakers and set up some forums that people can log into. And as I say, please do give us that feedback. So David, if I can hand over to you just to finish off, please.
Thanks, Nevin. Yeah, I haven't got a lot more to add, really. Just to say a massive thank you to Simon for his presentation, which was fascinating. We, as I said before, we're really privileged to be able to hear from him. I'd also like to thank everybody who's joined the forum this evening and taken time out of their evenings. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you found it informative. And as Nevin says, we want feedback. So if you've got any suggestions on topics that you'd like to see covered, please let us know. Also, please give us feedback on how you think this event was run, because we will always listen to you in terms of how we can improve things, make things run more efficiently, etc. So yeah, please give us your feedback, and yeah, keep your eyes out for the dates for forums coming up in the future. As Nevin said, there's going to be a fascinating one on poor beagles coming up in a few weeks. And there'll be a series of themed forums over the rest of the year. So I'd finally just thank everyone again. Thanks, Simon, again, and look forward to seeing you all soon. Thanks very much and good evening.